Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. I had a question from one of my subscribers about bugging in versus bugging out. Yes, indeed, this will be yet another bugging in versus bugging out video. For those of you in the graduated level of preparedness and survival, I have a feeling that you will benefit from some of the things I'm about to say as well. I'm going to be looking at bugging in versus bugging out and the various forms that would take in the context of mathematical game theory. Now, what game theory is, it's essentially a mathematical analysis of how different actors or units or participants are competing and conflicting for resources within a given environment or arena. Before I do that, I just want to say that I'm not naive to the challenges of the bush. In fact, I've probably spent more nights sleeping under the stars in the isolation work camps that I've worked in as a tree planter for 7 years, all across Canada, from BC to Alberta, the Rocky Mountains to the Shield in North Ontario. I've spent probably about 18 months sleeping under a tent, sometimes without a tent, rain or shine. I've probably been on more helicopters than most people who've done a full stint in the military, because a lot of the work blocks that I worked on were isolation work blocks, and they're called heli blocks, and essentially they fly you in the morning and you work all day, rain or shine, whether it's raining sideways or upside down, it doesn't matter, snowing, sleet, mud, bugs, whatever. So I'm not naive to the bush. That said, I'm by no means an expert when it comes to survival skills. There are people with bushcraft knowledge that far exceeds mine. In many respects, I'm still a novice in that respect. And actually, I would say full on that I am a novice when it comes to bushcraft skills. So now that I've sort of set the tone and spouted a bit of my cred, I'm going to jump right in. So there's two different types of fixed variables when it comes to bugging out that you must consider. There's some semi-fixed variables, and then there's some non-fixed variables. Now, bugging out, of course, basically, first and foremost, what you're doing is you're getting out of Dodge. Whether you're bugging out indefinitely into the wilderness, I'm never coming home type thing, and I'm never coming home isn't always bugging out into the wilderness. It could just be a semi-urban, rural, nomadic lifestyle, scavenging type lifestyle. Doesn't necessarily have to be a bug out into the wilderness lifestyle. Or it just could be bugging out and relocating. So I'm going to talk about the various things which go into making these decisions. Now, a lot of this should be common sense. You shouldn't be relying on me to know if you should bug in or bug out, but I'm going to give you some ideas so that you can perhaps more effectively mathematically deduce whether or not it's plausible, feasible, and a good idea to bug in or bug out. The first set of fixed variables that you want to consider are: what is the population density in the region that you're in? So population density is definitely going to come into play. If you're around the Great Lakes, yes, right now there might be a seemingly endless bounty of natural forests and woodlands, but when 40, 50 million people bug out to those woodlands, the resources are going to be exhausted rather quickly. Next is resource availability. Now, this is where that scarcity principle comes in, and this is why people are going to be fighting for resources in certain areas. So if there is limited resource availability, bugging out is going to be complicated, to say the least. So the land can only support so many people. If you look at the Inuit, for example, there's only so many Inuit people that the land in the Arctic can support, because there's only so much energy on the land to be had and harvested. Now, if you go down further south, the populations were greater in magnitude due to the greater abundance of food. And because of the natural ecosystems being compromised by modernity, due to the modern civilization and whatnot. Like I always use the buffalo, for example. The buffalo in the plains of Canada were the staple of Aboriginal people in this part of North America. Without the buffalo, subsistence in the plains is almost, I would say, impossible unless you were doing a strict hunter-gathering lifestyle where you were living off wild game like deer and stuff like that. The buffalo allowed for a certain type of nomadism, which will not be permitted today. So if you take these two variables, then you have population density, resource availability. If you have high population density and low resource availability, within that immediate region anyways, bugging out this should be a no-brainer, but it should not be something that should be attempted. Because what's going to happen is there's going to be an intense amount of conflict for resources, and there's going to be a lot of bloodshed spilled over the last pieces of meat. If there's a high population density and a high resource availability, of course, there's still going to be that conflict, but perhaps not as much. If there's a low population density and a high resource availability, hunter-gathering, depending on the other variables I'm going to talk about, could potentially, and I say potentially, be possible. Now, without those two things, and of course that's not a fixed scale. It's going to be variant. So there's going to be a gradient of population density and resource availability. But I'd say that low population density, high resource availability, like some places in the northern Canadian woodlands, may be possible for bugging out in a hunter-gathering sense. Now, there are some semi-fixed variables to consider. So one of those is your starting point. Now, I call this semi-fixed because, and some people would argue that this is a fixed standpoint, and I could see that. But, I just put it that way because, where you are is sort of a choice, so maybe it should be fixed. I haven't quite, determined whether or not it should be fixed or not. Next is going to be the timing. So, if it catches you off guard, where you are, where your family members are, the climate, the time of year, the season is going to be a huge factor. And of course, the type of disaster is going to be absolutely critical in determining whether or not you bug out indefinitely or you bug in. And if you bug out indefinitely, the type of disaster is going to determine whether you're going to be looking at a hunter-gathering lifestyle or you're just going to be bugging out into, like I said, a rural, urban, post-apocalyptic, scavenging type lifestyle. Now, another semi-fixed variable is local versus global. Now, if it's a local event, and by localized, I just mean it is contained within a relatively small area, say the size of a state of the United States. Then bugging out, depending on your proximity to that locale, that's going to have to be considered. So if a terrorist attack, quote-unquote terrorist attack, happens in California and you're in New York, chances are bugging out is probably not necessary unless you really do think that there's going to be another attack in New York. Of course, if it happens in California and you somehow happen to survive, then yes, bugging out would probably be essential. Unless, as DougBase654 had said recently, you wanted to stick around and provide some service. However, with that, you run the risk of becoming a person in need of rescue of yourself. So you have to weigh the pros and cons of that. Another factor to consider is this going to be short-term or enduring? Now, a localized terrorist attack would probably, with the help of, the rest of the country, would probably be contained and managed within a few months. So there may not be any sense in getting out of Dodge, per se. A global disaster, that's when you're actually looking at bugging out in the indefinite sense. Because, especially if you're forced out of the cities, Now, this is where starting point comes in. If you're starting off in the city, then you're going to have to, if you're lucky enough to escape the initial craziness and the rioting and the looting and scavenging and all that, and you have a fixed bug out location, and when I say global, I mean something on a national scale, something that is going to affect things for a long, long time, potentially 6 months to a year or indefinitely perhaps. So whether it's local or global, short-term versus enduring or long-term. Now, some of the non-fixed variables that come into play are knowledge. What is your knowledge of the land? What is your fitness level? How many people do you have in your group? What is the caliber and quality of your tools and materials that you'll be bringing? What are you going to be starting with? And I think most importantly, how determined you are to succeed. Now, I would say that if you had the knowledge of the land, if you knew how to hunt and, pick berries and, stockpile wild edibles through the growing season and store them for the winter and stuff like that, and you had a competent group of people, you had the proper tools and materials, you had the will to live, you had a good timing, so a good climate starting point, and a good starting point in the sense that you all were able to rendezvous at a certain fixed point where it was safe and outside the danger zone. You had an ideal climate, so perhaps spring or summer, and the disaster was a long-term, global, enduring issue, and you had a low population density and a high resource availability. Really, only under those instances would I ever really suggest that somebody bug out indefinitely in the nomadic, tribalistic, hunter-gatherer, egalitarian type way. Any one of those variables that's not met is going to drastically reduce the likelihood of your survival. Of course, the fixed variables are the most important, and descending downwards in importance to the non-fixed variables, because it doesn't matter how many skills you have, if there's no resources available, you can't get blood from a stone. If there's lots of population density, it doesn't matter how much your security tactics, how good you are in that respect, you're going to have to fight off a lot of people, and it likely will end in your demise. You might get on for some time, but sooner or later God is going to cut you down, as Johnny Cash might say. So you can look at this rather systematically. Now, let's say, for instance, myself, as a person who lives close to the tree line in the Canadian North, in the province of Saskatchewan, what would be an example of an ideal nomadic hunter-gathering bug-out scenario where you romantically go and live off the land and run with the bunny rabbits and the deer and whatnot, chase Pocahontas and all that? Well, for starters, it would need to be a global disaster. So perhaps a electromagnetic pulse which destroyed the power grid, forcing us out because we didn't have heating systems to stay warm. Now, of course, you're faced with the dilemma in that instance. Now, in the instance of global nuclear war or something like that, then yes, that would probably be the most plausible thing, is to go out into the wilderness, because to stay in the cities, most cities are going to get tapped. There's a lot of nukes out there. Some people say, there's only a certain amount of nukes for a certain amount of cities. You don't know how many nukes are out there. You're not privy to even the first level of what's considered top secret. So stop pretending like you know how many nukes there are in the world just because you watched it on the Discovery Channel. I mean, really think about that for a second. As if they're going to tell you how many nukes they have, much less for their opponents, their so-called opponents. Anyways, I'm getting off topic. But for me, it would have to be a global disaster. I would have to have the right group of people. I have the tools and materials. I have the level of fitness. I would need to improve my knowledge in some respects. I definitely have the will to live. The climate would have to be ideal. I might have the tools to get me through part of a winter. And by tools, I mean the resources, the supplies that I would bring. I may have enough food stores to last me for the first part of a winter. So if it happened right now, for instance, I may be able to make it till spring. And that's, of course, considering if you can manage to transport all those goods to your bug-out destination. And that's another thing, whether or not you have a destination is going to be a semi-fixed variable as well. I'm sure there's a lot other variables that you could put into this equation. But I think it's pretty clear that when trying to determine whether or not you should bug in or bug out, it's not really going to be rocket science. I could see a dilemma being if an EMP happened in, say, May, and you were faced with a choice of, do I stay in the city and tough it out through the summer, or do I retreat into some bug-out location in a more primitive setting, in a more rural setting, and start to get ready for the winter because the grid may not be back up for winter. So there may be certain dilemmas to that to consider, and you have to weigh the pros and cons, and that's where communication is going to come in. And that would be another non-fixed variable, communication. So, what information are you getting about the disaster at hand? How is it going to be remedied? If it's going to be fixed, if it's ever going to be fixed, these types of things. So let me know what you think about this equation, and feel free to add your comments, insights, criticism, comments, concerns, and I'll be more than happy to hear them and read them. I may not get back to every single one of them, but I assure you I will read each and every single one. So thanks for watching, Canadian.